On a spontaneous weekend trip, I decided to visit a small town called Raven Hollow, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests. The town wasn't listed in any tourist guides, but I had stumbled upon it while browsing old maps and was intrigued by its obscurity. Upon arrival, I was struck by the town's Gothic architecture. Buildings were adorned with intricate stonework, and cobblestone streets wound through the town like a maze. The residents were polite but distant, their interactions with me minimal. I checked into a modest bed and breakfast run by a man named Thomas. He was friendly enough but seemed preoccupied. When I asked about local attractions, he suggested visiting the town's historic clock tower. The clock tower stood at the town's center, its hands frozen at midnight. It cast a long shadow over the square, and despite its prominence, no one seemed to pay it any attention. I approached it, noticing that the doors were chained shut. An old plaque at the base mentioned that the clock tower had been built over a century ago but provided no further details. As I stood there, I heard a faint echo, like distant whispers carried by the wind. I looked around but saw no one nearby. That evening I dined at a local tavern. The atmosphere was subdued, with patrons speaking in low tones. I overheard fragments of conversations about the echoes and keeping the silence. When I tried to engage the bartender about the town's history, he diverted the topic. Back at the bed and breakfast, I asked Thomas about the clock tower and the whispers I had heard. He grew pale and advised me to stay away from such matters. He emphasized that some things were better left alone. Undeterred, I decided to explore the town at night. The streets were empty, and a thick fog had settled in. As I neared the clock tower, the whispers grew louder, forming unintelligible words that seemed to surround me. I noticed a side entrance to the tower that was partially open. Ignoring my better judgment, I slipped inside. The interior was dimly lit by moonlight filtering through cracked windows. Spiral stairs led upward, and I began to climb. At each landing, the whispers intensified. I reached the top chamber, where the clock's machinery lay dormant. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror framed in tarnished silver. Its surface was dark, reflecting nothing. Drawn to it, I stepped closer. The whispers coalesced into a chorus of voices, and the mirror's surface began to ripple. Suddenly, images appeared, faces twisted in anguish, reaching out as if trapped behind the glass. I stumbled back, horrified. The voices pleaded for release, their words overlapping in a cacophony of desperation. I realized that the mirror was a prison for tormented souls. Before I could react further, footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Thomas and several townspeople entered the chamber. His expression was one of regret. He said that he had hoped I wouldn't discover their secret. They explained that the town had made a pact generations ago to contain the malevolent spirits of Raven Hollow within the mirror. In return, the town was spared from their wrath. Outsiders were not meant to interfere. I protested, insisting that they couldn't keep such a thing hidden. They informed me that now that I knew, I had a choice: join their vigil to maintain the seal or become part of the mirror's collection. Faced with an impossible decision, I chose to help them. They instructed me in a ritual to reinforce the mirror's containment. As we performed the ceremony, the whispers subsided, and the mirror's surface became still. In the days that followed, I learned more about the town's burden. The residents were descendants of those who had trapped the spirits, and they were bound to this duty. They asked me to stay, offering me a place among them. I declined, feeling the weight of their secret too heavy to bear. They warned that leaving meant I could never speak of what I had learned. I agreed, understanding the consequences. As I departed Raven Hollow, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. The town remained hidden from the world, guarding its dark secret. I carry the memory with me, a silent witness to the sacrifices made to protect others. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I hear faint echoes and wonder if the spirits are still confined or if the seal has weakened, I hope that the people of Raven Hollow remain vigilant for the sake of us all. After years of living in the city, I decided to take a break from the fast-paced life and visit the countryside. A colleague had mentioned a quaint little town called Hollow Creek, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. It wasn't on any of the major maps, but I managed to find it after a few hours of driving along winding roads. As I approached Hollow Creek, I noticed that the town had an old-world charm. The houses were traditional, with wooden facades. The streets were lined with oak trees, their branches forming a canopy overhead. The locals went about their business, offering polite nods as I passed by. I checked into the only inn in town, a cozy place run by a woman named Margaret. She greeted me warmly and showed me to my room. The interior was rustic but comfortable, with handmade quilts and antique furniture. I felt a sense of calm wash over me, a welcome change from the city noise. After settling in, I decided to explore the town. I wandered through the main street, visiting small shops that sold homemade crafts and local produce. Everyone I met was friendly, but there was a peculiar sameness to their smiles and the way they spoke. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the close-knit nature of a small community. In the evening, I dined at the inn's restaurant. The menu featured traditional dishes made from locally sourced ingredients. As I enjoyed my meal, Margaret joined me for a chat. She asked what had brought me to Hollow Creek, and I explained that I was seeking a peaceful retreat. She smiled and said that many people found solace here. Her eyes held a depth that made me slightly uneasy, but her demeanor was pleasant. She mentioned that the town had a rich history and offered to show me around the next day. I accepted her offer, grateful for the hospitality. That night I slept soundly until I was awakened by a distant humming noise. It was faint but persistent, like machinery running underground. I looked out the window but saw nothing unusual. Deciding it was probably just an old building's quirks, I went back to bed. The next morning, Margaret met me after breakfast to give me a tour. She took me to the town square, where a beautiful fountain stood. The water sparkled in the sunlight and children played nearby. She showed me the library, the town hall, and the local school. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. As we walked, I noticed that there were no elderly people around. Everyone appeared to be middle-aged or younger. I asked Margaret about it, and she said that the older residents preferred to stay indoors. Her explanation seemed odd, but I didn't press the issue. In the afternoon, I decided to explore the outskirts of town on my own. I followed a path that led into the woods, hoping to enjoy some nature. After about an hour of hiking, I stumbled upon a large fenced-off area. Curious, I approached the gate, which was secured with heavy chains and a padlock. Through the gaps in the fence, I could see what looked like abandoned buildings and old vehicles. The place had an eerie atmosphere, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Just then, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Margaret standing there, her expression stern. She said that the area was off limits and gently guided me back to the path. On the way back, she was quieter than before. I felt as if I had crossed an unspoken boundary. That night, the humming noise returned, louder this time. It seemed to vibrate through the walls. Determined to find out what it was, I got dressed and ventured outside. The streets were empty, and the town was bathed in an unnatural stillness. I followed the sound, which led me back toward the fenced area. As I approached, I saw lights flickering behind the trees. I hid behind a bush and watched as several townspeople entered through a hidden gate. They carried equipment and wore expressions of focus. After they disappeared inside, I waited for a moment before creeping closer. I found the hidden gate slightly ajar and slipped through. The area was larger than I had thought, filled with dilapidated structures that looked like part of an old factory. I heard voices coming from one of the buildings. Peering through a cracked window, I saw a group of people gathered around a strange machine that emitted a pulsating glow. Among them was Margaret. They seemed to be discussing something urgent, their faces serious. Suddenly, the machine emitted a burst of light, and a holographic map projected into the air. It displayed several locations marked with symbols. I realized they were planning something, but I couldn't decipher what. Just then, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to see a man I hadn't met before. He looked at me with a mix of pity and regret. He whispered that I shouldn't be there and that I needed to leave immediately. He guided me back to the gate and urged me to return to the inn and pack my things. Confused and frightened, I followed his advice. Back at the inn, I hastily gathered my belongings. As I was leaving, Margaret appeared at the bottom of the stairs. She asked if everything was all right. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes held a coldness that unsettled me. I mumbled an excuse about a family emergency and hurried past her. I drove out of Hollow Creek as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I thought I saw the townspeople watching me from the road's edge, their faces expressionless. Months later, I tried to find information about Hollow Creek but found nothing. It was as if the town didn't exist. Maps didn't show it, and online searches came up empty. Determined to uncover the truth, I returned to the area where the town had been. To my shock, there was nothing there, just an overgrown field and remnants of old foundations. It was as if the town had vanished overnight. I don't know what I stumbled upon that day, but I believe Hollow Creek was hiding a secret, one that required the town to disappear without a trace. Sometimes I wonder if Margaret and the others were ever real, or if they were something else entirely. All I know is that I'll never forget the town that vanished. After accepting a teaching position in a small rural town called Everfield, I looked forward to a simpler life. The town was picturesque, surrounded by rolling hills and lush meadows. The community was tight-knit, and everyone seemed welcoming. I rented a charming cottage near the edge of town, next to an old manor owned by an elderly woman named Mrs. Whitaker. Her property was expansive, with beautifully maintained gardens that were the pride of the town. She was known for her generosity, often sharing produce and flowers with neighbors. One afternoon, I received an invitation to visit Mrs. Whitaker's garden. Flattered, I accepted and made my way over. The garden was even more impressive up close, a labyrinth of hedges, flower beds, and exotic plants. Mrs. Whitaker plants. As we walked, she pointed out various plants, sharing interesting facts and stories. However, there was a section of the garden surrounded by a tall iron fence. Dark vines clung to the bars, and the area beyond seemed overgrown and shadowed. I asked about it, and Mrs. Whitaker's demeanor changed subtly. She said that part of the garden was off limits due to unsafe conditions. Sensing her reluctance, I didn't press further. Over the following weeks, I settled into my new job and routine. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of Mrs. Whitaker tending to her garden, always avoiding the fenced area. My curiosity grew, and I wondered what secrets it held. One evening, as I was grading papers, I noticed strange lights flickering in the direction of the Forbidden Garden section. They were faint, almost like will-o'-the-wisps. Intrigued, I decided to take a closer look. Under the cover of dusk, I approached the iron fence. The air grew colder, and a sense of unease settled over me. Peering through the bars, I saw that the overgrown area was actually a cemetery, with old, moss-covered tombstones leaning at odd angles. Suddenly, I heard a soft rustling behind me. I turned to see Mrs. Whitaker standing there, her eyes reflecting disappointment. She said that she had hoped I would respect her wishes. I apologized, admitting that my curiosity had gotten the better of me. She sighed and explained that the cemetery was a family plot, dating back generations. The townspeople preferred not to discuss it due to tragic events associated with her ancestors. She urged me to forget what I had seen and to stay away for my own good. Over the next few days, I noticed a change in the way the townspeople interacted with me. Conversations would halt when I approached, and friendly smiles were replaced with polite nods. I felt like an outsider isolated by an invisible barrier. One night I was awakened by the sound of whispers outside my window. I looked out to see a group of people gathered near the edge of Mrs. Whitaker's garden. They held candles and seemed to be performing some sort of ritual. I watched as they moved in unison, their voices too soft to comprehend. Among them, I recognized familiar faces, my colleagues and neighbors. Fear gripped me as I realized that something was very wrong. The next day at school, the atmosphere was tense. Students avoided eye contact, and my colleagues were unusually distant. I overheard snippets of conversations about an outsider disrupting the town's harmony. Feeling threatened, I decided to confront Mrs. Whitaker. I went to her manor and was surprised to find the door unlocked. Inside, the house was dark, illuminated only by candlelight. I called out her name but received no response. As I ventured further in, I entered a room filled with portraits and antique furnishings. On a table lay an old book, its pages open to handwritten passages about rituals and sacrifices to ensure the town's prosperity. Horrified, I realized that the town maintained its idyllic appearance through dark means. The whispers, the ritual, the change in everyone's behavior, it all pointed to a sinister tradition. I heard footsteps approaching and quickly hid behind a curtain. Mrs. Whitaker entered the room, followed by several townspeople. They discussed the need to rectify the disruption caused by my intrusion into the forbidden area. Panicking, I waited until they left before slipping out of the house. I returned home, packed my essentials, and decided to leave immediately. As I drove out of Everfield, I glanced in the rearview mirror to see Mrs. Whitaker standing on the roadside, watching me with a somber expression. I reported my experiences to the authorities, but they found no evidence of wrongdoing. The town's reputation remained untarnished. I often think back to my time in Everfield, the town that hid dark secrets behind its charming facade. The memory serves as a warning that sometimes the most beautiful places can conceal the deepest shadows. During a road trip across the country, I found myself low on gas in the middle of nowhere. I took the next exit, which led me to a small town called Stillwater. The place seemed pleasant enough, with tidy houses and well-kept gardens. A banner stretched across the main street announced the annual Harvest Festival happening that very day. I thought it would be a nice break from driving, so I decided to check it out after refueling. I parked near the town square, where booths and stalls were set up. The decorations were charming, featuring pumpkins, corn husks, and colorful banners. However, I noticed that the atmosphere was oddly subdued. People milled about, visiting stalls and participating in games, but there was no music or lively chatter. Everyone moved quietly, speaking in hushed tones. I approached a stall selling homemade pies and greeted the woman behind the table. She smiled politely but said nothing. I asked about the price, and she pointed to a small sign. Feeling a bit unsettled, I bought a slice and moved on. The pie was delicious, but the silence around me was disconcerting. Children played nearby but didn't laugh or shout. Vendors conducted transactions with gestures rather than words. I approached a man running a game booth and asked how to play. He handed me a ball and motioned toward a set of bottles to knock down. I tried to engage him in conversation, but he only nodded and gestured. Confused by the lack of communication, I decided to find someone who could explain what was going on. I spotted a group of people gathered near a stage and headed over, hoping there might be an announcement or performance. On the stage stood an older gentleman who appeared to be a town official. He raised his hands and the crowd grew still. In complete silence, he gestured elaborately, and the crowd nodded in unison. The ceremony lasted only a few minutes before the crowd dispersed. I tapped a nearby woman on the shoulder and asked what the ceremony was about. She gave me a wary look and shook her head, then walked away quickly. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I made my way to the town hall, thinking someone there could provide answers. The receptionist greeted me with a nod but didn't speak. I asked if there was someone I could talk to about the festival. She wrote something on a piece of paper and handed it to me. It said, "Please enjoy the festival." Frustrated, I raised my voice slightly, asking why no one was speaking. At that moment, 2 men appeared from a side office. They approached me calmly and suggested through gestures that I should leave the building. As I exited the town hall, I noticed that people were watching me more intently. Their expressions were neutral, but their eyes followed me wherever I went. Deciding it was time to leave, I headed back to my car. On the way, I passed by a small park where I saw a young girl sitting alone on a bench. She seemed upset, so I walked over and asked if she was all right. She looked up at me with teary eyes and in a whisper, told me that I shouldn't have spoken. Surprised to hear someone break the silence, I knelt down and asked what she meant. She glanced around nervously and said that outsiders were expected to follow the town's customs, which included silence during the festival. I asked why, and she explained that long ago, the town had suffered a terrible event during a harvest festival. Since then, they believed that silence during the celebration would prevent misfortune. I thanked her for telling me and stood up to leave. As I turned, I saw a group of townspeople approaching slowly. Their faces were expressionless, and they formed a circle around me. She urgently whispered that I had to leave immediately. She pointed toward my car, and I began to walk briskly in that direction. The townspeople followed at a steady pace, their footsteps eerily synchronized. Reaching my car, I fumbled with the keys before managing to unlock the door. As I started the engine, the townspeople stood just a few feet away, watching silently. The girl stood among them, her eyes filled with fear. I drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror to see them standing in the road, still watching. Once I was back on the main highway, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The girl's warning echoed in my mind. A few days later, I searched online for information about Stillwater. I found historical records indicating that the town had been abandoned decades ago after a tragic accident during a festival. Reports mentioned a fire that claimed many lives, leading the remaining residents to leave. Perplexed, I double-checked the location and maps. According to all sources, Stillwater no longer existed. I couldn't reconcile this with my recent visit. To this day, I wonder if I stumbled into a place trapped in time, bound by rituals to prevent a past tragedy from repeating. The memory of the silent festival and the watching eyes remains vivid, a reminder that some secrets are meant to stay hidden